Welcome to the Customary Land Podcast. I'm your host, Spike Boydell. In this episode, I want to speak about something that, at first glance, might sound rather dry and technical. It concerns a global exposure draft on valuation standards. Now, to many people, that may sound like the sort of thing that only valuers, accountants, or standards boards would ever really care about, maybe some professional organisations. But, in fact, it reaches much further than that. Because once you start asking how land is to be valued, you're very quickly drawn into deeper questions such as what kind of land is this? What kind of rights are present here? Who has authority? Whose understanding of value is being used? And perhaps most importantly of all, what happens when a global technical framework tries to make sense of customary land without fully understanding what customary land is? That, in essence, is the issue I want to explore today. The immediate context is the current exposure draft of the International Valuation Standards. And to be fair, the draft does make an advance. It now expressly recognises that rights over land may be held in informal, traditional, undocumented, and unregistered ways, including communal, collective, and tribal interests. It also says that before undertaking such a valuation, the valuer must understand the relevant legal framework affecting the interest being valued. That is not nothing. It's a real step forward. So this is not a story about dismissing the draft entirely. It's more a story about recognising that it still does not go far enough, especially when it's dealing with customary, tribal, and Indigenous land. Because the problem with customary land is not simply that it's been omitted from the frame. The problem is that it's still being invited into a frame that was not really designed for it. This is the plurality of registers matter that we've talked about in other episodes of this podcast. And that framing, or those two registers, matter. One, Western commercial understanding of land and resources, the other customary stewardship and enduring guardianship over time. So it matters because customary land is not simply a version of ordinary landholding that happens to lack a registered title. It's not merely informal land waiting to become formal. It's not just a bundle of underdocumented rights sitting there waiting for the valuer to identify the right method and put a number on it. In much of the Pacific, as in many Indigenous and tribal contexts globally, customary land is a lived relational system. It carries stewardship across generations. It holds layered and shared use rights. It carries memory, identity, authority, and obligation. It's not exhausted by the language of ownership, and it cannot be adequately understood if the first question asked is simply, what is this worth? That, for me, is where the current exposure draft still falls short. Because although it allows customary and communal interests into the room, it still asks them to sit inside a valuation-first architecture. It still begins from the assumption that the task is to value an identified asset or interest. And that may sound innocent enough, but it's already doing more work than it appears. The exposure draft defines an asset as the economic right to an economic benefit. It defines value as the valuer's quantitative conclusion at a valuation date. Those definitions make perfect sense in many mainstream commercial settings, but they're already narrowing devices when we're dealing with customary land. They channel thought towards exchangeable benefit, measurable output, and temporal time-constrained closure before we've even established whether those are the right organizing concepts in the first place. And that is why this matters beyond the valuation profession. Because once you start from a wrong place, even a careful technical process, professionally undertaken, can quietly produce the wrong answer. Or perhaps more accurately, it can produce an answer to the wrong question. If the deeper issue is legitimacy, authority, continuity, and obligation, then a technically competent, professionally carried out valuation may still be premature. It may arrive too early. And that, in truth, is one of the deepest problems in this field. Over more than 3 decades of professional and academic work in valuation, compensation, and governance involving Indigenous, tribal, customary land systems, including here in the Pacific, I've repeatedly seen situations where valuation advice is asked to arrive before the harder questions have been properly held. Questions such as, is the proposed use legitimate? Has the right authority, pathway, been followed? Has the disturbance truly been minimized? Is this relationship governable across generations? What cannot be properly translated into money? Those are not anti-valuation questions. They are pre-valuation questions. And unless they're held first, valuation can end up doing work it was never designed to do. It can be made to stand in for consent. It can be made to stand in for legitimacy. It can be made to stand in for good governance. And once that happens, a technical method begins to carry burdens that properly belonged elsewhere. This is where the exposure draft's continued reliance on concepts like highest and best use becomes especially important. Again, in conventional valuation practice, highest and best use is entirely familiar. It has its place. But in customary contexts, it can become one of the main pathways by which market logic quietly outruns legitimacy. Because once the system asks what use would produce for highest value, the conversation can start drifting away from stewardship, shared use, customary authority, and intergenerational continuity, and towards optimization, towards development premium, towards the language of more intensive use, higher value use, or better economic utilization. The exposure draft itself links development, property, to circumstances where development is required to achieve the highest and best use, including land allocated for higher value uses or higher density. But for customary land, the most profitable use is not necessarily the best use. And more importantly, it's not necessarily a legitimate use. A use cannot properly be called best simply because it yields a higher exchange value if, at the same time, it weakens stewardship, fragments shared rights, destabilizes customer authority, or locks future generations into arrangements they did not authorize. So there's a deeper distinction here between optimization and legitimacy. And the standards draft, in my view, still does not see that clearly enough. There's a second problem too. The draft still treats intangible matters too narrowly. It says, in effect, that intangible assets fall outside the classification of real property, even though they may affect cash flow and therefore need to be dealt with in the scope of work. Again, that's understandable within conventional standards architecture. But for customary land, it is still too thin. Because in customary contexts, identity, spirituality, kinship, ancestral connection, and cultural obligation are not merely associated intangibles hovering at the edge of a land relationship. They're often constitutive of the relationship itself. They're the basis of it. They're not decorative extras. They're not merely adjustments to cash flow. They are part of what makes the land what it is, and part of what makes the rights what they are. Once we see that, it becomes much harder to pretend that everything important can be captured through a scope note, an assumption set, or a carefully qualified valuation figure. And this leads to a third issue. The standards remain heavily tied to the valuation date. And again, that's normal in valuation. A valuation is given as of a particular date. But customary land often does not conform neatly to that kind of temporal, time-constrained closure. The consequences of disturbance may mature over time. The effects of exclusion may not be immediate. Environmental and institutional consequences may outlast the project itself. And some forms of loss do not end when compensation is paid. That is especially important in the Pacific, where customary relationships are so often longitudinal. They stretch backwards and forwards. They connect the living, the dead, and those yet to come. So when a standard assumes that a value conclusion can close the matter at a valuation date, that may work for some commercial assets, but it may not work for customary land, because some obligations remain open, some accountability remains ongoing, and some losses leave what I would call a remainder, a moral or sacred remainder, something that cannot be fully extinguished by payment, however careful the valuation exercise may be. Now, this does not mean that valuation has no role, far from it. Valuation may still be necessary. Compensation may still be necessary. investors and governments may still need clarity. Development may still happen. But the sequence matters. That's the point. And this is where I think the idea of a governance legitimacy spine becomes useful. In my own current work, that orientation is reflected in an emerging framework known by the Fijian vernacular term sutu. As I use it, sutu is not being offered as a replacement for valuation standards, nor as a substitute for customary authority. It's better thought of as a backbone or spine, something that asks whether the right questions have been held in the right order before valuation advice is allowed to arrive. Only once the world has been properly understood can tools be introduced. Only once relationship, obligation, authority, and governance have been recognized can valuation become one lens, among others, rather than the system that silently takes over. In that sense, the deeper point is that governance architecture must come before valuation, not after it. And that, to my mind, is the central shortcoming of a current International Valuation Standards exposure draft. It recognizes customary land more explicitly than many earlier standards have. That's good. But it still does not redesign the underlying room. It still assumes that if customary interests can be named and classified, then the rest of the architecture can largely stay the same. I do not think that is enough. Because customary land is not simply a difficult valuation case. It's a different ontological and governance setting. And when we fail to recognize that, we create the risk of dispossession by formula. Not always by bad faith, not always by crude extraction, sometimes by technical tidiness, sometimes by elegant method, sometimes by frameworks that appear neutral, but which quietly privilege one way of seeing the land over another. That is why I have argued in my submission that what is needed is not merely better guidance on how to value customary land. What's needed is a threshold discipline before valuation, a pre-valuation legitimacy protocol, if you like. Something that requires the valuer, the client, and the intended users to stop and ask, is this subject matter even amenable to ordinary valuation in the normal sense? What is the authority structure here? Has the pathway of representation and consent been properly followed? What remains outside of monetization? What cannot be clearly translated into a closed monetary conclusion? Because unless those questions are asked first, the technical exercise may become overconfident. And that is particularly important in Indigenous and customary settings, where the language of free, prior, and informed consent also reminds us that valuation cannot substitute for proper authority or legitimate decision-making pathways. So where does this leave us? I think it leaves us in a position of cautious acknowledgement, but also firm critique. The International Valuation Standards draft is better than simple omission. It's better than pretending customary rights do not exist. It's better than insisting that only formal registered title can enter the valuation frame. But it still falls short because it remains too valuation first, too economically framed, too tired to closure, too ready to treat culture and spirituality as associated matters rather than constitutive realities, and too early to assume that technical method can compensate for a weak legitimacy pathway. For those of us working in Fiji, in the Pacific, and in the broader world of customary, tribal, and indigenous land, this is not an abstract concern. These standards shape practice. They shape advice. They shape how professionals are trained. And over time, they shape what kinds of reasoning become normal. So it matters greatly whether customary land is treated as an awkward variation within an existing system, or whether the system itself becomes capable of a deeper humility, a deeper pluralism, a deeper recognition that valuation has limits. That is really the heart of it. Not anti-development, not anti-investment, not anti-valuation, but resistant to the idea that valuation should arrive before legitimacy has been held, resistant to the idea that the deepest questions can be solved by method, and resistant to the quiet reduction of lived customary relationships into technical objects that fit neatly into a global framework, but no longer fully resemble the worlds they came from. So that is the intervention I'm trying to make. A respectful one, a constructive one, but also, I hope, a clear one. If global standards are genuinely serious about customary land, then recognition alone is not enough. Classification alone is not enough. The architecture itself must learn to slow down, to ask harder prior questions, and to allow that, in some contexts, the first issue is not value. It's legitimacy. Thank you for listening. If you'd like a copy of our full submission, or if you'd like to know more about SUTU and the forthcoming SUTU Mastery course, please email contact@customarylandsolutions.com. And if this conversation resonates with your own work on customary land, governance, valuation, or development in the Pacific, or elsewhere, please do share the episode. Until next time, stay safe, stay well.